Hello, my name's Jason. I'm not an archaeologist, but I do play one on TV. So come join me as we go into the dust.
This show has been brought to you by the letter F.
All right, so here we are at the letter F for formation processes. What are formation processes? Formation processes are basically all of the things that happen to an artifact or human remains, whatever we find as archaeologists, all of the things that happened to make that thing in the state it is today, or to make that site in the state it is today. And there are two types of formation processes: cultural formation processes and natural formation processes. Cultural formation processes are what people do to the stuff we find. Natural formation processes are what Mother Nature does to the stuff we find or the site we find, leaving it in the state we find it today. Now, cultural formation processes are basically what archaeologists study. It's human activity. So if you want to know what humans did to a thing, you look at the chaîne opératoire from episode C of the ABCs, which talks about all the things that people can do, the processes that they perform upon an object from its creation to its deposition. Now, the one that really throws people off is the natural one. You might wonder, do we as archaeologists even care about natural formation processes? Isn't that for like meteorologists to worry about the weather, or climatologists to worry about the climate, or geologists to worry about what the soil's doing? That's not our job as archaeologists.
Wrong!
The real answer is that formation processes are critical to interpreting and understanding the sites that we find. And the reason for this is we want to avoid something called the Pompeii premise. Now, this is the idea that people assume when they find a site that it's just sort of frozen in time.
You're frozen when your heart's not open.
This comes from the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, which was sitting right at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. And Mount Vesuvius blew its top, exploded, all that ash covered the city and killed everyone living there. And it kind of stayed that way because it was covered in ash. So if you go there, which I have, they're even sort of the bodies which were covered in ash still sort of in suspended animation. And that's great if you find a site like that. Not great that the people got killed, but finding a site that is just sort of frozen in time because you don't have much work to do. You can sort of see everything as it was. The issue, archaeological sites are almost never like that. So we do have to understand these natural formation processes, whether we like it or not. Don't believe me? Let me give you some examples for how this can go wrong. Let's take European societies over time in ancient history. So if you look at the Iron Age, Bronze Age, early medieval ages, you see a movement of settlements. It's almost like a little back and forth dance. In places, settlements move up the hill and down the hill, and up the hill and down the hill. And a lot of that has to do with instability, danger, violence. In times of danger, violence, instability, people tend to move uphill because at a higher elevation, you can see what's coming. You have the high ground, so it's easier to defend. In times that are easy and secure, people will be lower down in the valley so they can be closer to water, so they don't have to haul ass uphill all the time. Just makes more sense from a convenience factor. Now, let's think about the times when the settlements were up on top of the hills, like hill forts or something else like that. They're just up higher. Now, those people should leave plenty of traces, right? And everything will be very easy to find right there on top of the hill.
Wrong!
What happens over hundreds, thousands of years as it rains? What happens? The stuff that people have left on that hill, or even the buildings, will slowly get washed down the hill. So for this reason, really ancient spots that you know were on a hill, often the place you'll find the most stuff is at the bottom of the hill. If you didn't know anything about formation processes, you'd totally miss that. Or let's take animals, because animals can really mess you up if you don't know what you're looking at. So the last summer, I dug on an Iron Age site here in England. And in digging my pits, I did a couple, I came into some pretty big voids that actually, to the trained eye, were animal layers, like badger holes or something like that, groundhogs. Now, these critters are known to take stuff from one context and bring it to another. Now, remember, in archaeology, a context is a layer, and that basically corresponds to a certain time period. And unless you're having some pretty funky stuff going on, the lower the context, the older it is. So if you think about it, a badger moving stuff from one context to the other can get pretty confusing. Let's say Iron Age to early medieval. Well, the issue is in England, actually, the pottery from these two times can look quite similar. So things can get pretty confusing because of those little critters.
That funny?
Scavengers. Scavengers are another one. So you know what those are. Those are animals that feed off of dead things. You'll often see this in battles, right? If you watch Game of Thrones, the crows come, the dogs come, and they chew up the bodies. And when that happens, the fancy archaeological term for that is disarticulate the bones, for example, if they rip apart the skeleton. Now, in very old sites, Paleolithic, oftentimes people would find animal bones in either like human encampments and settlements or among human bones. And they assumed that the humans hunted these animals, and that's what we were looking at here. Well, after a time, once osteological practice had become more regularized and sophisticated, it actually turned out that the animals were killed by other animals. They could tell that with the teeth marks and the wounds. And it was the people kind of coming and picking up the leavings. It was the people who were scavengers in this case. So we as human beings have come a long way. Finally, another really good example, because they're everywhere, are earthworms. Earthworms are really good for the soil because they're constantly digging around, aerating it, digesting stuff, excreting it, and that keeps the soil healthy. Well, as that activity goes on and the soil kind of churns, things actually sink down in the ground. So things that are heavy and dense will sink over time because of the activities of earthworms. So if you think about a bunch of material that's kind of sitting there, let's say some pottery, which is very friable.
If you put in too much at once, it's going to lower your oil temperature.
Friable is a fancy archaeological term for crumbly. So crumbly, light pottery around some heavier objects, something metal maybe. Over time, the activity of those earthworms will cause the heavier, denser stuff to sort of sink below. So you might actually have metals and pottery from the same time, but in different contexts because of the activity of earthworms. Buildings sink because of the activity of earthworms. And I can't think off the top of my head what the rate is, but they actually have calculations in different parts of the world for how much things will sink based over time based on the activity of earthworms. So I think that that's pretty nifty, not to open up a whole other can of worms. So those were some pretty basic examples. Formation processes can actually become very, very complicated with things decaying and chemical reactions over time, things degrading. But those are some pretty simple examples, and they should give you an idea of why formation processes and understanding them are so important. So if you want to interpret a site, you got to know your natural formation processes. And of course, sort of the cultural formation processes are kind of what you're studying. So there you have it. F is for formation processes. All right, so we're actually going to be leaving the Roman Empire, which I know I've been talking about a lot recently, and we're going to head over to the Middle East. We're going to see one of the most iconic sites there and the most iconic site in Israel, Masada.
We're off on the road to Judea. We certainly do get around.
Now, this is an interesting case study for us as a site because it involves historical and biblical archaeology, which is a challenge because you're trying to reconcile historical and biblical written sources with the material record, and they don't always match. Also, it's a case of archaeology and the intersection of that with politics and religion, which adds another angle to it. So our tale begins way back in the Roman Empire again, at a time we've already looked at. We're going to AD 66. Remember, we've already talked about the Roman invasion of Britain in the Balkh episode, and that was AD 43. So these times are very close together. Now, it was at this time, AD 66, when the Jews of ancient Israel were revolting.
It is said that the people are revolting.
You said it. They stink on ice.
Well, wrong millennium, but you get the idea. The Jews in the Holy Land were pissed. And at this time, in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Jewish population was actually a dominant population, a very large population of the region. And for a lot of reasons, basically mostly dealing with Roman colonialist oppression, it was not going well. But just like Queen Boudica in Britain 5 years before this, these guys made a really bonehead move. You do not revolt against the Roman Empire at its peak. And just like Queen Boudica's fate,
I am Boudica. You are my people. We're in a time of extreme peril. We fight for our freedom.
the revolt was quickly put down. Now, it's important to note that this was actually the first of a series of wars called the Jewish Wars, which would engulf the Roman Empire over the next 70 years. I don't think it's totally clear what actually lit the fuse that started this, but I'm guessing it was a lot like what was happening in Britain and caused the revolt there. Basically, increased demands for tribute, repression, taxation, and outright theft by the Roman imperialists. Now, this was led by a group called the Zealots. Literally, the modern word zealot comes from this. But these guys weren't actually particularly religiously pious.
We're gathered here today because we are spiritual, but not like religious, you know?
They were actually more like a group of political radicals. And believe it or not, the other Jews didn't particularly appreciate them either. It seems that the bulk of the Jewish population were happy to protest, but they knew the dangers of open revolt against the Roman Empire. So those zealots, they're actually referred to as biryonim in the Talmud, which is one of the key Jewish religious texts. And that basically means they're a bunch of ruffians. And in fact, a particularly violent and radical group called the Sicarii, well, they splintered away from the main group of zealots. And they seem to have spent as much or more of their time attacking moderate Jews who they saw as collaborators than actually attacking the Romans themselves. Well, how do we know about all this, you ask? We know about it through a guy named Josephus, who seemed to be a perfectly placed, if not totally reliable historian.
Hey, Josephus! Hey, motherfucker!
Like many others, Josephus was captured and set to be sold into slavery. But somehow he got the ear of the Roman general Vespasian. And Josephus told Vespasian of a suspiciously flattering prophecy that he supposedly had, which was that Vespasian was soon to be the Roman emperor. And unlike all of Miss Cleo's prophecies, this one, it actually came true.
With the help of the spirits and my tarot cards, I can see your life even more clearly than you can yourself.
Anyway, this all had the desired effect on Vespasian, who rescued Josephus from the auction block and made Josephus his own personal slave. But to be the slave of the commanding general is not what you're thinking. He was an interpreter and was treated well, and it was probably actually a position of some kind of honor. And remember, Josephus had been a leader in the rebellion, so he knew where all the bodies were buried. So he served as Vespasian's interpreter for the next couple of years until 2 years later when Vespasian became the emperor. At that time, Josephus' services transferred over to Titus, Vespasian's son, who then became the leading general in the area upon his father's departure. And Josephus stayed with Titus through the whole conflict and was finally freed by Titus at the end and actually honored. This all gave Josephus a unique insight into the history of the times, having been a learned man and a leader on both sides. Now, Josephus would go on to write 4 books, The Jewish War, The Antiquity of the Jews, then one critiquing the Greeks and sort of positing the Judaism as the origin of philosophy, and also an autobiography. He went on to live a bunch more decades until AD 100, when he died at age 63, which was a ripe old age for the time. Now, for this episode, we're going to focus on that first book, The Jewish War. Like I said, this first war in which Josephus was captured, it did not go well for the Jews. They held out a couple years, but eventually the Second Temple, the holiest of holies for the Jews, was destroyed. That's actually where the Temple Mount is, the Dome of the Rock today, so that's what you'd recognize. Now, at this point, the Jews were enslaved, expelled from the Holy Land, and basically became a discriminated population in all over the Roman Empire, and they were a wandering people. So this was the beginning of the Jewish diaspora. Now, actually, the Jewish population in the east, in Babylon, or what is today Iraq, especially the city of Baghdad, that flourished as a result, and that's probably where the Talmud was written. Well, in the immediate aftermath of the temple's destruction, that radical splinter group, the Sicarii, they went rogue. And this is the time when they supposedly, through trickery, captured this old fort that had been built by King Herod, very infamous name in history, 100 years prior to that. Now, this fort was ideally located on the top of a mesa, so very defensible position, with great views onto the plains below and the River Jordan and the Dead Sea. They then based themselves at Masada and had a pretty successful go at raiding the Romans, and especially raiding Jews who they saw as collaborators. And it's important to mention that raiding is basically a historical euphemism for robbing, killing, and destroying. So they did a lot of that, supposedly killing 700 Jews in one go. So yeah, way back in the day, the Sicarii must have not been very popular among their fellow Jews. By the year 72, the Romans caught up with the Sicarii at Masada and surrounded the place. But one problem: how to get up. There was just one narrow path leading up to the fort that ran directly below the defenses, and presumably lots of projectiles hurled down by the defenders. And for their part, the Sicarii were happy to wait it out. You see, they had plenty of water, thanks to an elaborate system of channels and cisterns that collected water from the nearby wadi. And if you want to know what a wadi is, you can go back and look at the last news episode where I talk about that with Oman. But anyway, the defending Sicarii had plenty of water, and they actually also had a place to grow crops up there. So they were just happy to wait it out. So to get around this, the Romans undertook a huge feat by constructing a giant ramp made of dirt, of earth. Now, modern investigations have shown that this was actually built on top of a natural spur of the mountain, but it still was no easy feat. And once they did that, it was really just a matter of time. They brought up a huge battering ram and they breached the walls of Masada. But upon entering, they were greeted with a horrific sight, which is that everyone in the fort had committed mass suicide rather than being taken slaves. Now, that actually kind of makes sense. According to Josephus, there were just 960 people inside it, men, women, and children, and they were up against 8,000 or 9,000 fighting men of the Roman army and all of their retainers and hangers-on. So apparently, after a eloquent speech, or I believe 2, the Jews were convinced by their leader Eleazar to do the deed and, harry-carry.
Wait a minute, Mikey. But if he killed all his men, how did the map or the story get out?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Chunk. According to Josephus, there were 7 survivors, 2 women and 5 children, so they presumably told him what happened. But that pretty much closes the book on the story of Masada. It was a remote fort in a desert land that had been depopulated by the Romans, who killed everyone and sold them to slavery. It was hanging out on the south shore of the Dead Sea, which is dead, so there really wasn't any reason for people to go there for a very long time. It was not rediscovered until 1828 by a couple of Americans traveling through by chance. And the first test excavations would have to wait until 1959. And then a few more years after that, from 1963 to 65, with the first massive excavations, which were led by Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin, who was the former chief of staff of the Israeli military. And he would later go on to become deputy prime minister. So he led this huge excavation of the whole mesa, which involved thousands of volunteers, Christians and Jews from all over the world. And the findings he had were stunning. Here are some of the highlights. In terms of buildings, there were the defenses, 2 palaces, residential houses, storehouses, Roman-style bathhouses, and a synagogue, as well as those waterworks I mentioned before and that earthen ramp. The extreme dryness of the place made for some amazing preservation, and this is just crazy. They found the seed of a date palm that actually came from the time of the Sicarii rebellion. And in the 1960s, they were able to germinate that seed into a date palm plant. Who even knew that that was possible? They found hundreds of inscribed potsherd, and one of the really interesting ones had something written on it that basically translated into the king's garum. Now, what made this so interesting is that King Herod, who I mentioned before, he actually liked his luxury.
I heard that King Herod is bringing in gambling. Let's go, Miracle!
And he supposedly spent a fortune on a garum imported from Spain. Now, garum is a fermented fish sauce similar to what they eat all over Southeast Asia, actually. And we were told about this by Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian who we already discussed in this podcast, that died in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. And according to Josephus, he actually said the store of garum that King Herod amassed was worth more than the palace itself.
It's good to be the king.
They also found a potsherd with the name Ben Yair on it, and that may have been short for Eleazar Ben Yair, who is the commander of the fortress. Remember, the guy who convinced everyone supposedly to kill themselves. Another potsherd bore the name Cohen, which is sort of the high priest in ancient Israel. So the thought was that this was the sort of bowl for collecting tzedakah, or the tithe, for the high priest. And guess what? The name Cohen, that's actually my name, so I was kind of excited to see that. In a few locations, like the synagogue, they actually found scraps of scrolls, similar to like the Dead Sea Scrolls, also not that far from here. And these were various holy books of the Jewish Bible. One of them was actually a fragment of dry bones in the book of Ezekiel.
Dry bones, Ezekiel, cried them. Dry bones, Ezekiel, cried them. Dry bones, now hear the word of the Lord.
Perhaps the most interesting all were the human remains, which were actually pretty sparse, but did tell us quite a bit about the site. In the bathhouse, they actually found the remains of 2 adult males, or perhaps 1 adult and 1 juvenile male. And this is crazy too. They found preserved braided hair of a female. And that's just so hard to believe because hair very rarely survives. But it gives you a sense of how good the preservation is in a climate like this, that the hair did survive. And that is so interesting and tells us so much because they were able now to leverage some historical and biblical sources to learn more about this. So first, the science, the forensic analysis showed that this hair had actually been shaved off with a sharp object while the woman was living. Now, the book of Deuteronomy describes the shaving of the hair of a woman would be something that would happen when she was captured. And then, moreover, other biblical sources describe braided hair to be that of a married woman. So a married woman braided her hair. So taking that all together, it's quite possible that this is the hair of a woman that the Sicarii captured and enslaved and brought with them up to the mountaintop. The majority of the remains, however, were very fragmentary, so much so that they're not even sure how many individuals they represent, probably something like 24. And these were found in a cave at the base of the hill, which is kind of odd. But anyway, in 1969, the Israeli religious authorities declared that these were valiant defenders of the fort, Jews, and they were buried with full honors. The problem with that? Later analysis also showed that among the bones were pig bones. And if you know anything about Jews and kosher and Islam and halal for that matter, Jews and pigs do not go together.
How does that pig hate Jewish people?
So what's a more likely interpretation? Well, they could have been civilians from a later time, or they actually could have been Roman soldiers who were sometimes known to sacrifice pigs before a battle. But we can't even do any proper dating because the remains are buried and gone already, inaccessible. Other than hosting a small isolated Byzantine monastic community in the 7th century AD, the site was basically forgotten. And in this dry climate, that actually created the perfect conditions for preservation, almost offering a kind of Pompeii premise-like situation. Basically every archaeologist's dream. From an archaeology point of view, what's of interest here? Well, first, it shows the power of historical archaeology. Now, granted, Josephus is not necessarily the most reliable narrator, and he does make a few boo-boos. He says we'd find one palace, we found two. He claims we'd find remnants of an even older structure earlier than Herod's palace, and no traces of that were found. But there were some coins from the earlier era found. He also seems to have exaggerated the height and strength of the defenses, but guess what? He wouldn't be the first douchebag on the winning side who did that, especially in Roman times. Often the military stuff was exaggerated to make the winners seem more heroic for their great victory. Those speeches he talks about from Eleazar exhorting the people to kill themselves, well, that's a little sus. He probably wouldn't have had time to do that, and it's also highly unlikely the two traumatized women and the children would have been able to remember those, so it's not likely that that happened. But guess what? Roman historians did that all the time, inventing dramatic speeches in the heat of battle. And guess who else likes to do that? Hollywood. And they often stick out pretty badly in the movies.
With great power comes great responsibility.
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die with pride.
I am William Wallace, and I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny.
None of that stuff really bothers me. It's very common among ancient writers, and it doesn't really take away from the broad historical brushstrokes of Josephus's story. However, there is one controversial and very glaring fact, which is that the osteological evidence actually does not support the idea of a mass suicide. If anything, it seems to point to the fact that there are so few bodies, the people were probably carted off and sold as slaves as per usual. Of the remains that were found, the only two that seem to perhaps have been suicide were the two guys in the bathhouse, and for the lady whose hair that was, we really don't know. Now, what's pretty sus is that the whole mass suicide story actually seems to have been borrowed by Josephus by the siege of Yodfat. That was the battle in which he himself was captured. And that battle itself and the accounting of it is also a little weird, considering he talks about tens of thousands of people, and it's very unlikely that that many people would have been involved in a battle at this time. And once again, it's quite common that writers of this time exaggerate those numbers. And though, again, this doesn't change the sort of broad historical narrative that Josephus presents, the fact that there doesn't seem to have been a big mass suicide definitely takes the wind out of the sails of the heroic narrative that was spun around this site. You see, for Israelis, this site represents heroic resistance and the willingness to die by your own hand rather than be taken by as a slave, essentially victory forever. Now, the problem with that is, of course, all those people who died in the cave, the ones with the pig bones, well, they don't seem to have been Jews. And those people up in the bathhouse where Josephus actually said there were suicides, well, they were first presented, it was suggested anyway, that they were a family. And there's very scant archaeological evidence, and what evidence there is seems to suggest that that's not true. And remember, this whole heroic narrative was being spun around this group of particularly violent and zealots, people who killed a lot of other Jews. To be honest, they sound more like a group of assholes than a group of heroes. And remember the context. The excavations happened just about 15 years into the founding of the modern nation of Israel, although actually the publications would be decades later, actually even after Yadin, the lead excavator, had died. In fact, Masada was so important in the Israeli psyche that until the 1980s, all members of the Israeli Defense Forces had their induction ceremonies here as a symbol of the defiance and survival of the Jewish people. And remember, in Israel, everyone has to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces, all men and women. So there was a lot of myth-making and nation-building going on here. What are we to make of it? Forgetting what we think for a moment about these Sicarii, the fact is Masada does establish the fact that Israel was the ancient homeland of the Jews. Not that there was ever any real doubt about that. But does that give modern Jews the right to claim the land as their homeland? That was in 1947. What about all the populations that settled later? This also raises the point of past-present continuity, which, if established, and it often is on the scantiest of evidence, is grounds for the repatriation of artifacts and human remains, and that's a topic we've already discussed a bit on this channel. That's what NAGPRA, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, is all about. And does it matter that the ones that they've turned into heroes actually seem to have been a bunch of violent nutjobs who the other ones didn't like all that much? After all, Masada, imbued with all of this mythology, is a powerful symbol to the Jewish people. But what about all of the Jews and other people that haven't been discovered or didn't make it into the archaeological record? Does any of this give the descendants of those long ago people the right to this land now? I'm not saying yes, and I'm not saying no. The answer is definitely some mixture of sometimes, maybe, and it's complicated. And that's why there's a lot of fighting going on over there all the time. All I can say is they literally found a piece of pottery with my name on it, and that made the place feel personally special to me. Now, as a visit, it's pretty amazing, although I would hold off going there for now until things calm down in the neighborhood. But as a natural site, it's stunning. There is a cable car that can whisk you up to the top, but I'd actually opt for the walk-up. If my memory serves me right, it's about 45 minutes uphill, but not too difficult. But it does get hot aside from the winter, so go early and bring plenty of water. The ruins at the top are somewhat reconstructed, as I understand, which definitely helps with the visualization, but is controversial from an archaeology standpoint. However, like many archaeology sites, it is ultimately just a pile of stones. So you really do need to go there with a guide to interpret what you're seeing so you can really appreciate it and know exactly what you're looking at in each spot. Now, I was there quite a long time ago in 2001, and since then, they've apparently made a bunch of improvements. Apparently, there's a small but interesting museum on site and some improved signage, which you definitely will want to follow on your way up because it is a mountain. And apparently a few years ago, a wayward hiker who did not follow the signs wandered off the path and actually fell to her death. And you're definitely going to want to take a tour given the remote location, but there are a lot of those on offer. And helpfully, the entrance fee is relatively modest at just about US dollars $8.50, depending on the current exchange rates. Now that's very welcome in this otherwise frightfully expensive country. And while you're there, you'll definitely also want to check out the Dead Sea, which you can jump in and float because of the very high salt content. But do me a favor, do not pee in there. Just Google it. I'm not going to talk anymore about that.
When nature's calling, don't be stalling. Use your common sense. Before you let it flow, find a place to go. Just don't whiz on the electric fence.
And in this country that really is an archaeological wonderland, for me, it was the most memorable site. I'd recommend a visit, but it does give you a lot to think about.
Live from somewhere underneath the ground, Archaeology News, the news you can trust.
Well, it's been a busy news month in archaeology world, so let's jump right in. And today we're going to cover the good, the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. We're going to start off in Oman, beautiful country that I know very well, where dozens of Bronze and Iron Age structures have been discovered. Now, despite Oman's pretty small size, it's got a very diverse and rugged landscape, from the vast desert in the west known as the Empty Quarter to the very mountainous and broken up northeastern part of the country, full of valleys and craggy mountains. And also, despite its small size, it's full of archaeology. Now, this is probably due to the fact that it's, right in the middle of a whole bunch of cultures and empires and histories that it got mixed up in. It's also very dry, we know, good for preservation. And it hasn't experienced a really large-scale ruinous war in a very long time to destroy all of that archaeology. So in some of those valleys in the north and eastern part of the country, you'll find the Aflaj irrigation system, a very ancient system of canals. That's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You'll find crumbling mud brick villages all over the place. You'll find ancient, I think 5,000-year-old tombs at Al Ain. So there's a lot to see. In the west, you'll find ancient ports and cities that were built around the frankincense trade. Now, frankincense is a great incense, which was very highly prized in ancient days. So it was actually one of the gifts of the Magi in the Bible. And it comes from the resin of a tree, which pretty much only grows in Oman, Yemen, and Somalia. So very highly prized. And I actually burned some around here that I got in Oman and brought home with me. Anyway, this is not a travel site visit. So let's stick to the news about these ancient structures that were found, dozens of them. Anyway, as much as has been found, there's a lot that's still unexplored, at least to the trained eye that knows what to look for in this country. So enter the Polish Center for Mediterranean Archaeology at the University of Warsaw, acronym PCMAUW, which is not at all helpful, and this is not the Mediterranean, but anyway, they've been active in the country since 2016, and they found some really cool stuff, like a 4,000-year-old game board for a board game. Now, they did surveys of different parts of the country, and the most recent one that we're going to talk about now is the Komaira region in the northeastern part of the country. That's a mountainous region, and this is an area, that's in a valley in this sort of mountainous region. Now, this region, despite its remote location and inhospitable climate, actually had a population boom in ancient times for two reasons. The first one, wadis. Now, that's the same reason much of Oman became an early cradle of civilization. So what's a wadi? A wadi is essentially a deep, narrow valley or ravine where water collects, and with water you can have life. Now, how does this happen? Well, because it's a desert, there's not a lot of soil or trees or plants to sort of soak up the rain when it rains. So it rains, and due to gravity, the water gets funneled down over rocks, and over long periods of time, being channeled to the lowest point, it carves these deep valleys. And then the water collects there, even though it doesn't rain all that much. And when the water collects, you have fresh water, you have oases, and you have life. So there was a lot of that going on in ancient times. You can hear and see wadis all over the Middle East, particularly in Jordan. They have some famous ones to visit. And this is why civilization flourished there. Now, the other thing you had was copper. And what would copper be a major ingredient in? Bronze, as in the Bronze Age. So you had water enabling people to survive in ancient times, and you had copper, which gave them a very important trade good. So there was actually a pretty dense population here in the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age. So what the team found was about 4,500-year-old stone towers, so that's the Bronze Age, and a pretty densely packed, well-laid-out Iron Age town, about 3,000 years old. Now, these things, if you saw them, would probably just look like a pile of stones. But to the trained eye, the archaeologist's eye, they can actually tell by looking which stones are worked, so have been actually manipulated and shaped by humans, and also how they were worked. Was that done with hand tools, which would have been ancient methods, or with machines, which would be something more modern? So with those sort of visible cues, that's what sort of catches the team's interest when they do their surveying. I assume they did that through aerial and satellite imagery, and then visually scanned interesting looking places. I don't know that for sure, but that's how these things are often done nowadays over wide areas. Now, nothing particularly really sexy or photographic was found, but there's a few reasons I wanted to share this story with you. First, there's so much archaeology that's out there right under our very noses, and there's not enough people to really go looking for it and to spot interesting things. So if you're interested, there's actually a lot of ways that you can participate, either by looking at satellite imagery, looking at LiDAR imagery, and we talked about LiDAR in a previous version of the Archaeology News, or even doing old-fashioned field walking. Now, there's a few ways you can do this. Just do a Google search. There are projects that I know about where you can sort of scan bits and pieces of the earth through satellite image and record things that you find. Check with your local university archaeology department or your local archaeological society. Second, it's actually the value of pre-reading, studying up, and going with a good tour guide that actually transforms the whole experience of visiting an archaeology site. You know, after all, and take it from me, I've been to hundreds of archaeology sites. If you visit some amazing places like the Palace of Knossos, which I'm going to discuss in an upcoming site visit, or even Stonehenge, sort of the mother lode of archaeology sites, they are really just a pile of stones, disappointing ruins. I mean, even that game board I showed you before, would you have recognized that if you just came across it on a little hike? No. So this is really how to do this kind of tourism the right way. And trust me, having visited hundreds of archaeological sites, it's a whole different experience. Okay, now to the bad. Afghanistan, which has known sort of nothing but war and instability in the last 40 years, is one of the worst sites in the world for archaeocide, destruction of archaeology sites. Who can forget right before 9/11 the destruction by the Taliban of those Bamiyan Buddhas, which at the time were the largest Buddhas in the world? Now, of course, in a war, we first and foremost care about the human toll, but somebody has to care about the archaeology, just as someone has to care about the animals and someone has to care about the environment. So when we're thinking about the ancient monuments and sites, archaeologists are the natural people to be caring about that. So that's what we're going to talk about in this story. Well, through some remote monitoring projects of the type that I just told you about that you can partake in, archaeologists in recent years, since 2018, began to notice something very distressing. So Afghanistan, even in ancient days, was home to a thriving population and civilization. Alexander the Great actually made it all the way there and conquered a people in the Bactrian kingdom. And this is centered in the current day province of the Balkh province. So he conquered Bactria from the Achaemenid Empire, which he defeated. That's basically Persia, Iran. He defeated that empire. And he took, I think she was the daughter of the emperor, Roxana, to be his bride. And there are still people in this part of the world who, some of them have reddish hair, green or blue eyes, that trace their ancestry to the Greeks and claim to be descendants of Alexander. I actually met some of these folks and stayed with them when I visited Uzbekistan a few years. This was a distinct ethnic group who still lives up in the mountains and claims their ancestry from Alexander the Great. Well, this rich civilization at the time, this is the 4th century BC when Alexander was around, actually left behind quite a lot of archaeology in the form of burial mounds and treasure hoards. And actually a pretty amazing one was found very nearby where we're going to talk about now. Now, what the archaeologists began to notice, again in the late 2010s, was the destruction and looting of a lot of these mounds. And since I'm talking about 2018, that was before the Taliban returned, and then it happened after the Taliban returned, which I think was in 2021. So under both regimes. I'm going to show you what this looked like, and these photos are all courtesy of the BBC. The remote monitoring team found about 200 sites that had been damaged, and they actually have on camera bulldozers and other earth-moving equipment in the act. So they caught them with their hands in the cookie jars, but no punishment because they're not on the ground. And, because of the war and poverty in this country, no one has really gotten in a long time to really examine these things. And what it really amounts to is a wholesale destruction of the material culture and heritage of this part of the world. And unfortunately, probably the only way we will know if any riches were found is by monitoring auction houses and antiquities dealers in major European and American cities, because that's often where these things wind up. And that's why it's really important not to buy any unprovenanced antiquities. That's been very much in the news lately, especially with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, a place I knew very well, having grown up in New York, having to sell, give back, return so many items in its inventory in recent years. However, what's lost forever and is more important than the shiny stuff is the knowledge. And as viewers of this show will know, a lot of that knowledge is found in sort of microscopic particles in the soil. So if you destroy the mound, you lose all of that. And that's really a shame for future generations of Afghans who won't now understand as much about their own history and culture, which is lost forever. And that's often a unifying factor in a country, especially that's as divided and split up into different sort of groups and tribes as Afghanistan is. And of course, the tourist dollars, the desperately needed tourist dollars that they might have earned from this one day once the country eventually stabilizes. Now, unfortunately, this is often very common in conflict zones where there's poverty, and oftentimes it's people's only meal ticket is selling, looting antiquities, which also, by the way, is why Afghanistan is like the most important source of opium in the world, poverty. That's often one of the only ways these people who are in very desperate situations can get ahead. However, in this case, we know that it was earth-moving equipment and bulldozers and those big shovel trucks that did this, not people carrying shovels. So that means whoever did this actually had access to money. So these were probably these local warlords and other poobahs that, really control a lot of the little local areas in Afghanistan. Now, for the record, the Taliban denies everything. They actually claim that they've been enforcing antiquities trafficking laws and catching people. But in any event, we know the stuff is being stolen and these mounds are being destroyed, and the people who are doing that have means. So hopefully something can be done at some point to stop this. But in a place like Afghanistan, there's not that much hope. Anyway, now to the ugly, royal tombs. Now, these royal tombs are beautiful, but sometimes what was found in them is not so beautiful. We're sticking with Alexander the Great and actually his family tomb. So Alexander the Great was a Macedonian, and that was from the Macedonian province of Greece, not the country now known as North Macedonia, which, Greece and North Macedonia almost came to war over the name, so they take it quite seriously. Anyway, so Alexander was from the Macedonian dynasty. He himself was buried in Alexandria, named after him, in Egypt, but his tomb has been lost, although there are people still hunting for it. Anyway, in 1977, his family's big burial complex was found in near a village called Vergina, which is near the, I think it's the second largest city in Greece, called Thessaloniki. Great food. And I actually just, in the past year, went to both North Macedonia and Thessaloniki. So yeah, near the village of Vergina. Try saying that 10 times fast. Uh-oh! Now, based on the elaborate nature of the site, the finds, the dating, archaeologists knew these were, this should be royalty, and they knew it was the time of Alexander. They just never quite knew who was who. Well, thanks to some new interpretation, which is informed by a lot of science and actually historical sources, a team has claimed to have identified Philip II, that was Alexander's father, his newborn son, and wife, which was another woman, not Alexander's mother. In fact, I think she was younger than Alexander himself. Philip had quite a few wives and different baby mamas. So the bones that were found on the site, of course, were analyzed and compared to the written histories of the time. Now, even though this was 2,400 years ago, the Greeks actually wrote a lot of stuff down. A lot of it survived. And because this was about Alexander the frickin' Great, who conquered more of the world than anyone else had until that point, there was a lot written about him. Now, what's new here is the bones, in addition to being subject to advanced osteological analysis, were also subject to macrophotography, basically super close-up photography, and radiographs, which are kind of X-rays, and analyzed that way as well. All right, so here's the ugly part. In the first tomb, which had been heavily looted, I think even in ancient times, there was a scattering of bones, again, because the site had been looted. And the bones were identified to be those of an adult male, an adult female, and a newborn baby. And this would basically speak very strongly for Philip II, his wife, Cleopatra. No, not that Cleopatra, a different one. And the newborn baby who she had, who actually written sources say were all murdered. And number one suspect in the killing, Olympias, who would be Alexander the Great's mother. What would have been her motive? Her motive would have been to remove another claimant to the throne and put her own son on the throne. And if that was her motive and she was the one behind it, she succeeded, because Alexander the Great, before he was the Great, became the king succeeding his father. So the new analysis aged the adult male at 45 years old, which actually matches up very well with Philip's supposed age of 47 when he was assassinated. Remember, he was Alexander's dad. Previous analysis had put the age of those remains at 25 to 35 at the time of death. But that was based purely on dental analysis. So we do know there were some teeth found among those bones. Moreover, some examination of the leg bones, because there was a pretty complete leg, I believe, they showed a sort of injury, a fusion at the knee, which would have caused a very, very uneven gait. And that also matches the written sources tracing to Philip, because Philip was supposedly lame, as they called it back in the day.
LeMay?
Also, the fact that this particular tomb, and there were several other tombs found, the fact that this particular one was not particularly elaborate also speaks to the idea that this was Philip's. You see, when Alexander took over, it was obviously in a time of turmoil because the king had just been assassinated. And as we know, there would very, very quickly be some wars, which Alexander used to quickly build his empire. But the point is, if he took over in a time of instability with wars on the way, he wouldn't have had money or really the time to focus on building an elaborate tomb. So that also suggests that it's Philip's tomb. The earlier interpretation of the human remains at time of death being 25 to 35, as well as some ancient texts which suggested that Philip had been cremated, that led this identification of these remains to be a different family member. But now the new study, re-aging the human remains and actually re-examining those historical sources and claiming that they were mistranslated, that it didn't necessarily say that Philip had been cremated, that's what changed the interpretation to, yes, this is Philip II and his wife and newborn son. A nearby tomb, which is much more elaborate, houses a much more complete skeleton of a man with no signs of significant injury. And that would actually make more sense for Arrhidaeus, who was Alexander's brother who succeeded him. Now, the written sources aren't that specific, but Arrhidaeus actually had some kind of mental handicap, which means he wouldn't have really gone into battle and hence wouldn't have sustained a lot of injuries in his life, which again suggests the skeleton is probably his. The fact that it's more elaborate is normal for normal for a monarch, and we explained why Philip II's would have been a relatively poorer tomb. Previous analyses of this particular skeleton, the more complete one, had suggested there was an injury to the eye, somewhere in the skull around the eye, which would have made it a lot of sense for it to be Philip, because Philip actually had supposedly sustained an eye injury with an arrow. Now, this has been disputed by the new analysis that claims that that supposed injury is really just a normal anatomical feature, so that means it's not Philip. Now, going back to Arrhidaeus, he also died by assassination at 39, which is consistent with the aging of this particular skeleton. And guess who supposedly had him killed? You guess it? Olympias, Alexander's mother again. She really was an ancient femme fatale.
You hesitate, she will strike.
But don't worry, she actually also got her own, as she was stoned to death by the families of a lot of her victims. Pretty gruesome, pretty ugly, these ancient Greeks. Jeez. Well, anyway, ugly story, but beautiful use of archaeology and science, and matching that with historical sources to try to solve a historic mystery, which is what I said a lot of archaeology is. It's being historic detectives.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
However, this is all pretty new and it's still somewhat disputed, so watch this space. We'll see how this debate shakes out. Finally, to the beautiful, and I'll make this short and sweet. We're going to go to Staffordshire in England, where a metal detectorist found a 3,000 or even 4,000-year-old dress clasp. So it's from the Bronze Age and made of gold. Now, we can't date it better than that without more context because it's very difficult to date gold. While not overly elaborate, there's a simple beauty in its clean lines and simplicity and symmetry. And actually at about 5 inches, 13 centimeters, 4 ounces, 115 grams, it's not too small either. But why is this worth mentioning on such a busy archaeology news day? First, it's just one of 7 found in Britain, meaning it's really rare. Second, it was actually believed to have been made, these kinds of dress clasps, in Ireland, which shows that even in this very, very long ago time, in this very, very far-flung corner of the world, there was still pretty long-distance trade way back in the Bronze Age. But finally, the fact that it's gold, the size of it, it's definitely a treasure, meaning it falls under the UK Treasure Act.
Treasure bath! I'm going to have a treasure bath! Treasure bath!
Now, it's complicated, but what that essentially involves is that public institutions like museums have first dibs on purchasing the item so that it can be preserved for the public. Now, that Treasure Act, what it defines as treasure, has recently been expanded because there was a lot of stuff slipping through the cracks that wasn't, treasure as we think about it, like gold, but maybe something slightly less valuable in terms of monetary value, but rich in information and, for the value for the public to see it. Remember, it's not all about the Benjamins. It's about information.
Drive millenniums, it's all about the Benjamins.
But the good news is that the detectorists actually get the money. Remember, it's the museums have the right to purchase the item, which means the money goes to the detectorist, or the detectorist gets to keep the item. And they also share that with the landowner if there is one. So this system actually encourages people to report stuff. And the information gets put into something called the Portable Antiquities Scheme. There's a process for that. I think they have to call the county coroner. But anyway, the information is not lost. And as archaeologists, that's what we're most interested in. So the system actually works pretty well. And beyond being a win-win situation, the UK Treasure Act and the Portable Antiquities Scheme has created an actual pretty big database and valuable source of information that academic archaeologists are building into their research and reports. So you know what? Quite frankly, a lot of archaeologists don't like detectorists. A lot of detectorists don't like archaeologists. But I think increasingly they make a good team. So I don't see why this can't be kind of a kumbaya relationship. So that's the beautiful. And there you have it. I distill the archaeology news in a very busy archaeology news month with the good, the the bad, the ugly, and the beautiful. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.